September 1944. Eastern France. By this point in the war, the Allied advance through, France had become something close to a relentless machine. After the breakout from Normandy, American armored columns surged forward faster than many planners had expected. Towns fell in hours instead of days. German rearguards collapsed or withdrew before full engagements could even form. Roads that had once carried retreating civilians now carried fuel trucks, ammunition convoys, and endless columns of olive-drab vehicles pushing east. But war has a way of leaving behind problems that refuse to be outrun. Across the French countryside stood dozens of old fortresses. Some dated back centuries. Others had been modernized in the early 20th century. Thick stone walls, elevated ground, narrow approaches. Structures designed in an era when defenders expected to fight from behind. Masonry rather than maneuver across open fields. Many of these fortifications were no longer strategically decisive on their own. But they still mattered when they sat astride supply routes, road junctions, or river crossings. One such fortress now stood in the path of the American Third Army. Inside it were roughly 2,500 German troops. Not an elite formation, not a carefully assembled garrison, just the remnants of multiple units that had retreated faster than their orders could keep up. Infantry companies reduced to platoons, artillery crews who had lost their guns elsewhere, officers who had gathered whoever they could, and moved into the strongest position available, because stopping felt better than running. Command of this improvised garrison rested with a German major. He was not famous. He was not politically important. His name would not appear in textbooks. But in that moment he represented something larger than himself. The mindset of officers who believed surrender was worse than annihilation, and that dramatic defiance could somehow substitute for strategic reality. Outside the fortress stood American forces under the command of General George S. Patton. Patton's reputation had preceded him long before his tanks did. To American soldiers, he was aggressive, demanding, and brutally honest about the purpose of war. To German intelligence officers, he was something more unsettling. A commander whose behavior was consistent, predictable, logical, and therefore dangerous. Patton did not believe wars were won through restraint for its own sake. He believed wars were won by breaking the enemy's ability and willingness to resist as quickly as possible. He also believed that unnecessary fighting was wasteful, not immoral, wasteful of time, resources, and lives that could be spared if an enemy chose surrender when defeat was inevitable. That philosophy shaped how he approached every fortified position in his path. The fortress in eastern France presented a problem, but not an unusual one. It sat near a key road junction. Leaving it intact meant American supply convoys would have to detour through longer, less reliable routes. Bypassing it entirely would leave a hostile force in the rear. Capable of harassing traffic and threatening logistics, it could not be ignored forever. There were three basic options. First, a prolonged siege. Surround the fortress, wait it out, starve the garrison into submission. This could take weeks. Weeks the Third Army did not want to spend standing still. Second, a direct assault. Storm the walls, accept casualties, take the position by force. This would be faster but costly. Third, surrender. Patton always preferred the third option when it was available. Not because he was soft and not because he enjoyed negotiations. He preferred surrender because it was efficient. A surrendered enemy no longer required bullets, no longer delayed movement, no longer consumed attention. So Patton did what he usually did. He sent an officer forward under a white flag. The message was simple, standard, almost boring in its professionalism. Surrender now. Avoid unnecessary bloodshed. Your men will be treated as prisoners of war in accordance with the Geneva Convention. There was no threat in the message. No insult, no grandstanding. Just a clear statement of outcomes. You surrender, your men live. You resist, you fight a battle you cannot win. Inside the fortress, the German major received the offer, and he rejected it. But he did not simply say no. He framed his refusal as a moral statement, an oath, a declaration of honor. He informed the American officer that he had sworn never to surrender to American forces, that he would defend the fortress to the last, and then he delivered the line that would define everything that followed. It was meant to sound heroic, defiant, final, the kind of line officers imagine will echo through history. The American officer returned to Patton's headquarters and delivered the response. Those present expected anger, or at least irritation, perhaps a string of profanity, perhaps in order to bypass the fortress temporarily and deal with it later. Instead, Patton's reaction was calm, almost clinical. According to accounts from officers present, Patton listened, nodded, and replied with a sentence that carried no emotion at all. I can arrange that. To understand why this response mattered, You have to understand something about Patton that is often misunderstood. He was not impulsive. He was not reckless. He did not act out of wounded pride. What made him dangerous was that he took people seriously when they told him what they wanted. The German major had just declared his preference: death before surrender. Patton did not interpret this as rhetoric. He interpreted it as a statement of intent, and Patton believed that once intent was clearly stated, there was no point pretending otherwise. The fortress in eastern France presented a problem, but not an unusual one. It sat near a key road junction. Leaving it intact meant American supply convoys would have to detour through longer, less reliable routes. Bypassing it entirely would leave a hostile force in the rear, capable of harassing traffic and threatening logistics. It could not be ignored forever. There were three basic options. First, a prolonged siege. Surround the fortress, wait it out, starve the garrison into submission. This could take weeks. Weeks the Third Army did not want to spend standing still. Second, a direct assault. Storm the walls, accept casualties, take the position by force. This would be faster but costly. Third, surrender. Patton always preferred the third option when it was available. Not because he was soft and not because he enjoyed negotiations. He preferred surrender because it was efficient. A surrendered enemy no longer required bullets, no longer delayed movement, no longer consumed attention. So Patton did what he usually did. He sent an officer forward under a white flag. The message was simple, standard, almost boring in its professionalism. Surrender now. Avoid unnecessary bloodshed. Your men will be treated as prisoners of war in accordance with the Geneva Convention. There was no threat in the message, no insult, no grandstanding, just a clear statement of outcomes. You surrender, your men live. You resist, you fight a battle you cannot win. Inside the fortress, the German major received the offer, and he rejected it. But he did not simply say no. He framed his refusal as a moral statement, an oath, a declaration of honor. He informed the American officer that he had sworn never to surrender to American forces, that he would defend the fortress to the last, and then he delivered the line that would define everything that followed. It was meant to sound heroic, defiant, final, the kind of line officers imagine will echo through history. The American officer returned to Patton's headquarters and delivered the response. Those present expected anger, or at least irritation, perhaps a string of profanity, perhaps in order to bypass the fortress temporarily and deal with it later. Instead, Patton's reaction was calm, almost clinical. According to accounts from officers present, Patton listened, nodded, and replied with a sentence that carried no emotion at all. I can arrange that. To understand why this response mattered, you have to understand something about Patton that is often misunderstood. He was not impulsive. He was not reckless. He did not act out of wounded pride. What made him dangerous was that he took people seriously when they told him what they wanted. The German major had just declared his preference: death before surrender. Patton did not interpret this as rhetoric. He interpreted it as a statement of intent, and Patton believed that once intent was clearly stated, there was no point pretending otherwise. From that moment on, the fortress was no longer a negotiation problem. It was an engineering problem. Patton began issuing orders immediately, not vague directives, not emotional commands. Precise instructions designed to end the situation quickly and decisively. First, he ordered a complete encirclement, not a loose containment. A seal, roads blocked, paths monitored, no movement in or out. The fortress would be isolated from the outside world. No reinforcements, no resupply, no escape. Second, he ordered heavy artillery brought into range, not light field guns. Heavy pieces specifically capable of destroying fortifications. Guns that could crack stone walls built to withstand centuries of warfare. Third, he requested air support, not random bombing, precision strikes, aircraft assigned to specific targets within the fortress complex, command areas, artillery positions, ammunition storage. Finally, Patton ordered loudspeakers forward. This was not an act of cruelty. It was an act of psychology. The Germans inside the fortress would be told exactly what was coming, not in vague threats but in schedules. At this hour, artillery. At this hour, airstrikes. At this hour, assault. They would have time to think. Time to question their commander's judgment. Time to consider whether his personal oath was worth their lives. Patton believed uncertainty broke morale faster than chaos, and certainty, when it promised destruction, broke it faster still. What followed would not be a dramatic last stand in the traditional sense. There would be no prolonged duel, no drawn-out siege, no romantic imagery of defenders holding the walls against impossible odds. What followed would be a demonstration, not just for the men inside the fortress, but for everyone watching. Because Patton was about to prove something that many commanders never fully grasped. When someone dares you to do what you were already prepared to do, they are not issuing a challenge. That is their purpose. Thick walls, narrow gates, elevated positions, every architectural feature exists to send a message to the people inside. You are protected. And to the people outside, this will be costly. For centuries, fortresses had worked exactly as intended. They bought time. They forced attackers into difficult choices. They allowed smaller forces to resist larger ones. But by 1944, the nature of warfare had changed faster than most fortresses had. Inside the stone walls of this fortress in eastern France, reality was far less reassuring than the masonry suggested. The garrison numbered roughly 500 men, but they were not a unified force. They were fragments, survivors of units that had retreated under pressure, reorganized hastily, and gathered wherever defensible ground still existed. Some had fought in Normandy. Others had been pulled back from earlier positions farther west. A few had never even met the major, who now commanded them until they arrived at the fortress gates. Their equipment reflected this disorder. Rifles and machine guns were plentiful, but ammunition stocks were uneven. Artillery pieces were present, but not all were properly sighted, and some lacked adequate protection from counter-battery fire. Communication lines inside the fortress were improvised, not hardened. Radios worked, but reliability was uncertain, and morale was brittle. The German army in 1944 was not the force it had been in 1940. Years of attrition had hollowed out experienced leadership. Replacements arrived with less training, less confidence, and a growing awareness that the strategic situation was collapsing. Soldiers knew the Allies had landed in France. They knew Paris had fallen. They knew the front was moving east, whether they resisted or not. Many of the men inside the fortress understood, something their commander refused to accept. The war was no longer about winning. It was about surviving what came next. The German major saw the situation differently. To him, the fortress represented a line, not a tactical line, but a moral one. He believed that surrender was a personal failure, that refusing to give ground even when defeat was certain preserved honor, that a dramatic stand would redeem earlier retreats and restore discipline among men who had grown accustomed to falling back. He spoke often of duty, of oaths, of what history would remember. What he did not speak of, at least not openly, were the odds. American artillery superiority was overwhelming. Allied air power dominated the skies. The Third Army was advancing with speed and momentum that made isolated resistance increasingly meaningless. Every officer inside the fortress who had any exposure to recent fighting knew this. Junior officers began to question the major's decision. Almost immediately after the surrender offer was rejected, when a small group of soldiers attempted to approach a damaged section of wall with the apparent intent to surrender, they were intercepted. According to later testimony, at least one was shot as an example. The message was clear. Surrender was not just forbidden, it was treason. This decision shattered what remained of cohesion. Fear of the Americans had been replaced by fear of their own commander, and that kind of fear does not inspire resistance. It accelerates collapse. By midnight, the fortress was a pressure cooker. Men whispered about the loudspeakers, about Patton's reputation, about what American artillery had done to other positions. Some had seen the results firsthand in earlier battles. Others had heard enough to fill in the gaps. Outside, American forces waited. Patton had deliberately chosen to delay the attack until morning. Not out of courtesy but calculation. He wanted the defenders to spend the night thinking, to let doubt spread, to let the weight of certainty press down on them without relief. Inside the fortress, the major remained defiant. He believed resolve could overcome material disadvantage, that by forcing the issue to its extreme, he could impose meaning on an otherwise hopeless situation. He told his officers that history favored those who stood fast, that even defeat could be transformed into honor. What he failed to understand was that history does not reward intentions, it records outcomes. And by the time dawn approached, the outcome was already being decided, not by artillery or bombs, but by morale. When the first light crept over the horizon, many of the men inside the fortress were no longer thinking about victory. They were thinking about survival, about whether obedience to a single officer's pride was worth the lives of hundreds. They were about to find out how much Patton valued efficiency, because at dawn, exactly as announced, the guns would begin to fire. The sky lightened in shades of gray, then pale blue, as if the world itself was hesitating. Inside the walls, men watched the horizon in silence. Some clutched rifles. Some sat with their backs against stone, helmets pulled low, waiting for a sound they already knew was coming. Outside, American artillery crews were ready. They had spent the night preparing firing tables, checking coordinates and registering targets. This was not going to be a random bombardment. Patton had made that clear. Every gun had an assignment. Every battery knew exactly which section of wall, which courtyard, which structure it was responsible for destroying. At the designated minute, the first gun fired, then another, then dozens. The sound rolled across the countryside like a physical force. Shells arced overhead and slammed into stone that had stood for generations. The fortress shuddered as if struck by a giant hammer. Dust and fragments of masonry erupted into the air. Inside, men were thrown to the ground. Ears rang, lights flickered and died. This was not an attempt to intimidate. It was an attempt to dismantle. Patton had no interest in theatrical destruction. He wanted breaches. He wanted collapse. He wanted the defenders to understand as quickly as possible that their position was no longer defensible. Shells struck the same points again and again. Artillery doctrine had evolved far beyond simply firing until something happened. Repeated hits on identical sections of wall created fractures. Fractures became gaps. Gaps became entrances. German artillery attempted to respond. A few guns fired from concealed positions within the fortress. Their crews worked quickly, desperately, trying to reassert some sense of agency. But American counter-battery fire was immediate. Spotters had been waiting. Within minutes, return shells crashed down on the firing positions. Guns were smashed. Crews were killed or scattered. Survivors learned the lesson quickly. Firing back meant drawing fire. Inside the fortress, the command structure began to unravel. Communication lines were severed by collapsing walls and fallen debris. Runners attempted to carry messages through smoke-filled corridors, but many never reached their destinations. Orders became confused, contradictory, outdated by the time they were received. And still, the loudspeakers continued. The broadcasts were calm, almost detached. They described what was happening. They announced what would happen next. They repeated the offer of surrender. This combination, destruction paired with clarity, was devastating to morale. The defenders were not just being attacked. They were being informed step by step that resistance was pointless. The guns fell silent. For a moment, the fortress existed in an unnatural quiet, broken only by the crackle of small fires and the groans of wounded men. Some defenders believed the bombardment was over, that perhaps the worst had passed. The preparation had been so thorough that organized resistance barely existed. German soldiers fought in isolated pockets, often without knowledge of what was happening elsewhere in the fortress. When confronted, many chose to surrender immediately. Others fired briefly, then laid down their weapons. American loudspeakers moved forward with the assault, repeating surrender instructions in German. The message was consistent. Resistance meant death. Surrender meant life. By late morning, the outcome was inevitable. The only remaining organized resistance centered around what was left of the major's command bunker. There, with a small group of loyal soldiers, he made his final stand. When American troops breached the position, the major reportedly raised his pistol. An American sergeant fired. There was no speech, no ceremony, no final declaration. The major had said Patton would have to kill him to take the fortress. That condition had been met. The remaining soldiers immediately surrendered. The entire operation, from the first artillery round to the final surrender, had taken less than 12 hours. For a position that had been expected to hold for days or weeks, it was a devastatingly brief end. But the consequences of what had just happened were only beginning to ripple outward. When the guns fell silent, the fortress looked less like a military position and more like a ruin, reclaimed by violence. Stone walls that had stood for centuries were split open. Courtyards were filled with debris, twisted metal, and shattered equipment. Fires smoldered in pockets where ammunition had cooked off or fuel stores had ignited. Smoke drifted upward, marking the place where Defiance had collided with overwhelming force. American medics moved in almost immediately. This was not an afterthought. Patton had made it clear that once resistance ended, the rules changed. Wounded men, American and German alike, were to be treated. The distinction was no longer enemy versus friendly. It was wounded versus able-bodied. German prisoners, many still shaken, were escorted out in groups. Some looked relieved. Others looked numb. A few stared back at the wreckage in disbelief, as if trying to understand how a position that had felt so solid only a day earlier could have collapsed so completely. Casualty assessments began quickly. American losses were minimal. A handful of soldiers had been wounded by sporadic, small arms fire or falling debris during the final assault. None were killed. The preparation had done exactly what it was designed to do: reduce resistance before infantry ever entered the fortress in force. German losses were far heavier. Roughly 200 soldiers were killed, most during the bombardment and airstrikes. Another several hundred were wounded. The remainder, around 1,000 men, were now prisoners of war. The German major was dead. He was not buried with ceremony. He was identified, recorded, and moved like any other casualty. His name did not matter. His rank no longer mattered. What mattered was that his decision had shaped the fate of every man under his command. American intelligence officers conducted a rapid assessment of the fortress. What they found confirmed what Patton had already suspected. There were signs of internal collapse well before the assault began. Notes from junior officers questioning the decision to resist. Evidence of executions carried out to enforce discipline. Positions that had been abandoned without orders. Ammunition that had been stockpiled but never properly distributed. The fortress had not fallen because it was weak. It had fallen because its leadership had failed to adapt. Patton toured the site the following day. He did not celebrate. He did not pose for photographs among the ruins. He moved through the fortress with the same pragmatic focus he applied to everything else. He asked questions. He reviewed damage. He spoke briefly with officers responsible for the operation. According to those present, he made no grand speeches. At one point, he remarked simply that the major had said he would have to be killed. That requirement had been fulfilled. But Patton also did something else. He visited the German wounded. He ensured that American medics were treating them properly. He made it clear that mistreatment of prisoners would not be tolerated. This was not contradiction. It was consistency. Patton believed that violence had a purpose in war. And once that purpose was achieved, continued brutality was not strength, it was waste. To his own troops, the message was clear. The Germans inside the fortress had been given a chance to surrender. They had refused. What followed was the consequence of that refusal. But once they laid down their arms, they were no longer targets. This distinction mattered deeply to Patton. Be ruthless in combat. Be professional in victory. Never confuse the two. Word of the fortress spread quickly through American units. For many soldiers, it reinforced what they already believed. Patton would not hesitate. He would not be intimidated by dramatic statements. But he would always offer a way out first. Among German forces, the story spread even faster. It was retold not as a tale of heroic resistance, but as a warning. Officers repeated the details to their subordinates. American surrender offers, particularly from units associated with Patton's Third Army, were no longer dismissed casually. The lesson was simple and unsettling. If Patton offered surrender, it was not a negotiation tactic. It was a factual assessment. Refusing did not delay the inevitable. It only changed how much destruction occurred before the end. Some German officers later admitted during interrogations that they chose to surrender specifically because of what had happened at the fortress. They understood that Patton did not bluff. He did not posture. When he said he would take a position, he meant it. And if challenged, he would respond with overwhelming force rather than symbolic gestures. From a psychological standpoint, the operation had achieved far more than the capture of a single road junction. It established predictability. German commanders knew what to expect from Patton. There would be an offer. There would be a clear outcome. And if they rejected the offer, the response would be swift, coordinated, and devastating. Predictability in warfare can be terrifying. Defiance, when backed by nothing but pride, does not become courage. It becomes liability. And in modern war, liability is eliminated quickly. Still, questions lingered among American officers, among historians, among anyone who examined the event closely. Could it have ended differently? Should Patton have tried harder to persuade the major? Was there a moral obligation to keep negotiating, even when the other side had declared their willingness to die? These questions would not be answered on the battlefield. They belonged to a deeper discussion, one that extended beyond artillery and tactics, into leadership, responsibility, and the consequences of absolutism. And that discussion was only beginning. This is the burden of leadership that is rarely discussed openly. Leaders do not get to make symbolic choices that only affect themselves. Every dramatic declaration binds others to its consequences. Every refusal, every escalation, every oath spoken in absolute terms becomes a chain around the lives of subordinates. The men inside the fortress did not swear the major's oath. They were not asked whether they wanted to die for a position that would fall within hours. They were not consulted about whether symbolic resistance was worth their lives, their limbs, or their futures. They were ordered, and when some attempted to choose survival instead, they were punished by the very authority that claimed to be protecting their honor. Patton understood something the major did not. That discipline imposed through fear of one's own commander is weaker than discipline grounded in trust. Once soldiers fear their leaders more than the enemy, Cohesion collapses. Loyalty turns brittle. Resistance turns performative. This is why Patton's response to the Major's challenge was so chilling. He did not argue. He did not moralize. He did not attempt to shame or persuade beyond the initial offer of surrender. When the Major said, "You will have to kill me," Patton did not hear defiance. He heard a preference, and Patton believed that once a preference was stated clearly, pretending otherwise was dishonest. Some critics have argued that Patton should have tried harder to negotiate, that he should have prolonged talks, offered guarantees, appealed to reason or humanity. But negotiation only works when both sides are willing to compromise. The Major was not. He had defined surrender as unacceptable under any circumstances. He had framed death as preferable. At that point, further persuasion would not have saved lives. It would only have delayed the same outcome while conditions deteriorated further. From Patton's perspective, prolonging the situation would have been irresponsible. Every hour spent negotiating was an hour that American supply lines remained vulnerable. Every hour increased the risk of casualties from accidents, snipers, or miscalculation. Every hour reinforced the illusion inside the fortress that resistance might still matter. Patton chose decisiveness, not out of cruelty but clarity. Once resistance ended, his behavior reinforced that distinction. German wounded were treated. Prisoners were protected. There were no reprisals, no collective punishment. Violence stopped when its purpose was achieved. This consistency is what made Patton feared. Not his temper, not his profanity, not his reputation. It was the certainty that he meant exactly what he said. German commanders who learned about the fortress understood this. They adjusted their behavior accordingly. Many chose surrender when faced with similar offers, not because they lacked courage, but because they understood the consequences of refusing. This was psychological warfare at its most effective. It taught that dramatic defiance does not intimidate an opponent who is already prepared to use force. It teaches that absolute statements invite absolute responses, and it teaches that when facing someone who takes words literally, every sentence becomes a commitment. For modern audiences, the story raises uncomfortable questions. Is there honor in dying for a lost cause? Does a leader have the right to choose death on behalf of others? At what point does stubbornness become negligence? There are no easy answers, but there is one truth that remains difficult to ignore. The Major said he would only surrender in death. Patton accepted those terms. The fortress fell. The road opened. The war moved on. The Major's name faded into obscurity. The men who survived lived out the rest of the war in captivity, and many returned home afterward, alive, because they surrendered when given the chance. This is the lesson the fortress leaves behind. War is not a test of how bravely one can refuse reality. It is a test of how responsibly one confronts it. Leadership is not measured by how loudly one declares resolve, but by how carefully one weighs the cost of that resolve on others. And when you challenge someone to do what they are already capable of doing, you should be prepared for them to accept the challenge without hesitation. Because with men like Patton, dramatic defiance is not deterrence, it is permission.